Okay, if you're an educator, you know this challenge all too well. How do you manage a classroom while also being super sensitive to student trauma? It's such a delicate balance, right? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how to navigate it. So let's just dive right into the big question, the one that I think is on everyone's mind. As more of us become trauma-informed, there's this fear, a fear that by setting a boundary or redirecting a student, we might actually be causing more harm. And look, it's a completely valid concern, but it might be based on a little bit of a misunderstanding of what a trauma-informed classroom really needs. So, let's start with our first big idea here. A lot of people seem to think that being trauma-informed means you have to be permissive. But the truth is, it's actually the opposite. Structure and safety, they absolutely go hand in hand.
And this, right here, is the crucial point. Let's be really clear. Providing structure and redirecting behavior is not by itself re-traumatizing. The real question isn't if we intervene, it's all about how we intervene. Is our approach building safety, or is it just escalating the whole situation?
Think about it. A classroom that doesn't have clear boundaries can feel really chaotic, totally unpredictable. And that is the exact opposite of what a student who's experienced trauma needs. That proactive, predictable structure, that's what creates the feeling of safety. So intervention, when it's done the right way, is actually a huge part of the solution.
All right, so if we're all on board that we do need to intervene, the very first step is figuring out what we're looking at. See, not all behaviors are created equal, and our response shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all thing either.
We've all heard this saying, and honestly, it's the golden rule here. Overreacting to something small can turn a tiny disruption into a major classroom meltdown. So the first skill we have to master is diagnosis. Are we dealing with a little molehill, or is this a full-blown mountain?
This chart really lays out the difference pretty clearly. Nuisance behavior, that's the small stuff. The constant fidgeting, a student being off task for just a second, yeah, it might get a little annoying over time, but if you look at it in isolation, it's not a huge deal. Problem behavior, on the other hand, is different. That's what actively disrupts learning, pulls other kids off task, or even makes the room feel unsafe. Your response has to match the category.
So once you've figured out what kind of behavior you're seeing, you need the right tool for the job. And the good news is, it pretty much boils down to two main strategies, one for the small stuff and one for the real problems.
For that nuisance-level behavior, the best approach is to be indirect. The whole goal is to avoid feeding that behavior with your attention. So you might use what's called planned ignoring. Or you could praise another student nearby who is doing the right thing. Then, and this is great, the moment the first student fixes their behavior, you catch them being good with some specific praise. You're reinforcing the positive without ever getting into a power struggle over the negative.
But what happens when that line gets crossed? When a behavior goes from a nuisance to something that's actually disruptive or unsafe? Well, your strategy has to shift. You can't ignore it, you have to intervene, and you've got to do it directly. The process for this is a super simple three-part script. First, you clearly and calmly tell the student to stop the behavior. Second, you direct them to the positive behavior you want to see instead. And third, and this is so important, you reinforce them as soon as they comply. You're not praising the bad behavior, you're praising their choice to listen and follow your direction. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the student, but if we want to be effective, trauma-informed managers, we kind of have to look in the mirror. Our own internal state is a massive factor in these moments.
I absolutely love this quote. We always say practice makes perfect, but that's not quite right, is it? Practice makes permanent. That's so true. What you practice becomes your automatic response. So if you want to use these tools effectively, especially when you're stressed out, you have to practice them until they become muscle memory.
And that's because we all experience these things called vulnerable decision-making points, or VDPs for short. This is when your own state, being tired, hungry, totally stressed, collides with a really difficult situation. And in that moment, you are much, much more likely to react based on an unconscious bias rather than your best, most thoughtful self.
So how do you handle a VDP? You use something called a neutralizing routine. It's just a pre-planned, simple action. A great way to do this is with an if-then statement you've already decided on. Like, if I feel myself getting triggered by a student, then I will take one deep breath before I say anything. That tiny little pause, it can be the difference between a thoughtful response and a really harmful reaction.
So finally, let's just put all of this into perspective for a second. What is the actual goal of redirection? It's really important to be crystal clear about what this tool is for and, maybe more importantly, what it's not for.
I think this is the perfect analogy. I want you to picture a fire department pulling up to a building that's on fire. When they get there, they have one priority, and one priority only.
Right? They don't stand around debating how the fire started or trying to design a new fire prevention plan for the building. They put out the fire. That's it. And that is what redirection is. It's about stopping the immediate problem to make sure everyone is safe and that learning can get back on track. It's the immediate, necessary first response.
And that, right there, is probably the most important takeaway of all. Redirection stops the crisis. But it doesn't teach new skills, it doesn't build relationships, and it doesn't address the root cause of the behavior. By itself, it is just not enough. It's a critical tool, for sure, but it's only the first step.
So, the fire is out, the behavior has been redirected, the classroom is safe again. Now what? That's the real question we have to ask ourselves, isn't it? How are you going to build rapport? How will you reteach expectations and create a system that prevents that fire from even starting in the first place? Redirection just buys you the time to do that really crucial work.